Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the second weekend of February 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original, taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. Today, we'll discuss President Trump's tariffs and trade negotiations. We'll hear more about the jetliner and helicopter collision that occurred in Washington, D.C. last week, and we'll look at DOGE and President Trump's efforts to make budget cuts. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on tariffs and the deals President Trump has struck, it's our Dan McCaleb.
It's been another hyperactive week for the administration of President Donald Trump, who started the week, last weekend actually, announcing new tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China. But by early in the week, both Canada and Mexico relented on Trump's demands for more border security efforts to slow the flow of fentanyl and other illicit drugs into the U.S., and the president then paused the tariffs for 30 days. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Center Square. Casey, the stock market tumbled early Monday after Trump first announced the tariffs, but they have since rebounded after the tariffs on Canada and Mexico were paused because they gave in to Trump's border security demands. Are the president's tough negotiation tactics working?
Are they working? Wow. Well, time will tell. I mean, I think that for all the reporting on the stock market and the small wins in negotiations, this is a policy that is so fresh, so new. I mean, we haven't really had tariffs like this in over 100 years in the U.S. So to say that any of these experts really know what is going to happen, it's all speculation. And so I think it's going to take months. You know, we're going to be well into Trump's presidency before we see the full impact of these tariffs, the pros and the cons. And many of the cons have been pointed out by the media, by others, and I think there's real reason to be concerned. Energy prices, for instance, if we start importing our energy from Canada with tariffs, and they start tariffing us, that could raise energy prices. That's a real thing. Of course, Trump hopes to offset that with his own domestic drilling. So that's a good example of, will energy prices go up? It's like, well, you have to weigh the tariff against Trump's own domestic energy policy. You can't just look at the tariffs isolated. And I think that's what everyone's been doing. They say, oh, if this tariff goes through, prices will raise this much and economic input will be decreased this much. And, maybe that's all true, but they're not taking into account the other deals the president's going to be making. And I'm not saying he necessarily, compensate for all these tariffs with his other deals, but if he puts a tariff on one country and then goes and makes a deal with a different country to replace them, well, that changes the calculus. And so I think a lot of these experts have to be a little bit humble and patient with seeing exactly how this is going to play out, what else is going to go along with these tariff plans. But to your point about the stock market, Dan, there is certainly a lot of uncertainty. And the stock market doesn't like that. We're definitely in the land of uncertainty on these tariffs right now.
Agreed. But I think what much of the media ignores when it comes to Trump's tariffs is that it's all part of the negotiation tactic, the art of the deal, right? Mm-hmm. He's looking for concessions from these countries, Canada and Mexico, let's just start with, because of the border crisis over the 4 years of the Biden administration. He's constantly said that Mexico and Canada aren't doing enough to slow the flow of illegal immigration into the United States, to slow the flow of illicit drugs like fentanyl into the United States. He got concessions from the Mexico president, from the Canadian prime minister on border security efforts, and the tariffs are paused. Trump is known for his negotiation skills, and I think that this is more about getting concessions than it is about placing, 25% tariffs on the U.S.'s neighbors.
Right. I mean, and that certainly could be the case. Even in the negotiation, though, I would say there's going to be maybe some periods of time when we do experience those tariffs so Trump can prove he's not bluffing or something. So that's something to consider. But with the negotiations, I mean, you're right. I mean, he has gotten these concessions. Now, critics of Trump were quick to point out that, Canada and Mexico, they were already planning to do this. This is a hollow victory. But I didn't really buy that argument because politicians say a lot of things, but when they actually act is what's important. And they may have been promising or saying they were going to do these things, the leaders in Canada and Mexico, but with these tariffs forced action. They forced a sense of urgency. And that's been the hallmark of Trump's presidency so far, a sense of urgency. We can barely keep up with these executive orders and these tariffs and these new actions and appointees and all these things. So there's a lot of things that people have been talking about should happen, but these tariffs, Dan, to your point, create a sense of urgency and say, no, it's going to happen now, not, over the next 6 or 12 months. It's going to happen tomorrow, which is a timeline that, I'm here in the DC area. I know how people think. They don't think in terms of days when it comes to policy. They think in terms of, quarters and years and decades. They think of funding over a 10-year time span. So Trump's able to put this sense of urgency and say, no, this is going to happen today. And I think that's really the strength of the negotiating tactic.
These tariffs on China, you reported this week that it also could lead to an end of a tax loophole for these Chinese retail outlets, online retail outlets like Shein and Temu, who have been able to skirt U.S. import laws and tariffs on those imports because of a loophole in the law. You report on that this week. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So while the Mexican and Canadian tariffs were a bit more unconventional and surprising and controversial, the Chinese tariffs were more well received, I think. And it's a very, multifaceted issue. But what you're referring to that I reported on is that there's been this thing called the de minimis exemption where, Chinese companies were able to ship directly to American consumers packages as long as they were less than $800 in value without really paying taxes on them. And they were also able to avoid a lot of the security screening that larger packages receive. And so because of that, one, they were evading an incredible amount of American taxes. We're talking hundreds of millions of packages, billions of dollars use this exemption. And companies like Shein and Temu, their whole business relies on it, basically. And so it was raising real concerns in addition to the tax concerns about security. And they were able to smuggle a lot of fentanyl. Different, nefarious actors were able to take advantage of the lower security and smuggle the fentanyl. So these new tariffs apply to that. The tariffs against China close this loophole effectively. I think this is one, whereas, Mexico and China, there's a hope that we might have more of an amicable relationship because of their proximity to us. When it came to being tougher on China, I think Trump's policies are more well received.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the mid-air collision that took place over the Potomac River last week, it's Eliana Kernodle.
It has been just over a week since an American Airlines jet and an Army Black Hawk helicopter collided over D.C. Additional information has been uncovered this week, and investigators are working to piece together what occurred. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Sarah Roderick-Fitch. Sarah, what do we know about the circumstances of the collision?
Well, as of right now, thankfully, all 67 victims have been recovered, and they have recovered most of the aircraft, and they're now taking it and going to be piecing it back together. But as of right now, the NTSB released a report saying that they know the Black Hawk helicopter was flying around approximately 300 feet at the time of the collision. And now they said that they rounded to the nearest 100, so that's why I say approximate. And that is about 100 feet above what is the permitted ceiling for that area, for like especially DC, because it's within this commercial airspace along the Potomac, which is very narrow in itself. So that is where sort of the investigation is looking at right now. They're just looking at, I think they're going to be looking at timing. There's all sorts of different aspects they're looking at. They've been focusing more on the aircraft right now and recovery process, the black box, recorders and whatnot. They've been doing this sort of the same thing with the Black Hawk, but their focal was to get as much stuff from the actual jet. And now they will be shifting to recovering the Black Hawk. And so they will get sort of more information, but they're also looking at information communications between the air traffic controllers and all that, just to try to piece together the timeline and what happened. And if any of the pilots if they saw each other, there's some questions, if there were some blind spots, if there were some night goggles being used in the helicopter and whatnot. So that's what's happening with that.
And I know you live in the area. Have you been able to see any of this site?
Yes, actually, I did. I visited Joint Base Anacostia and Bowling, which is the southern part of DC. And that's actually the sort of the closest point to the wreckage and the collision where it happened. And I think many people would be shocked to know this because you can't really see it from the other side. It's kind of hard to see it from other parts of DC where other people could kind of see it. So it's sort of a restricted area. It's a very restricted area where you can kind of come and onto the base. You have to have base access in order to see it. But the wreckage itself, the helicopter, the Black Hawk helicopter, was just yards actually from the shore and from military housing. The collision itself looks like it occurred, from what I can tell, yards from the base. This was a very tragic event, but I don't think, again, people are realizing that if it happened a little bit more inland or a little bit closer to the shore, we could be looking at a much bigger tragedy with housing there. And then there's also a child development center as well that's right there. So if it had been a little bit earlier, a little bit more inland, it certainly could have been tragic. It's very scary indeed. And so it sort of affected, the base operations and whatnot.
And as this investigation goes forward, what can we expect?
So there's going to be they're going to be focusing on sort of the helicopter, again, the ceiling of where the helicopter's at, the height, where they were flying. And the reason why Reagan National Airport, or locals would say DCA, that's sort of the code for the airport there. It is a very challenging airport, actually. There's a very narrow flight path. And that's due to sort of security. You've got the Pentagon, in Virginia on the southern side, and you've got Washington DC. You've got the White House, you've got the Capitol, you have all the sort of the monuments, you've got all that. And then to the north, along again, the Potomac up there, you have the CIA headquarters. You got Langley up there. So the planes have to come along, if they're coming from the north to the south, they have to fly along a very narrow path along the Potomac, and they have to come down. And it's not a very large airport as far as like just the land size. It's very, very limited. If for anybody who's ever flown in or out, when you land, the runways are not very long. The pilots will hit the brakes very quickly. So it is very, it's very limited, but it is actually a very busy airport. It's actually busier than Dulles Airport, which is the international airport. And there's 800 plus flights that come in and out of DC each day. And there's been an ongoing debate. They've had a parameter rule in place for years, which basically sort of limits sort of the flights like to, I think it's 1,250 miles, only allowing so many flights that are further away. So like the West Coast and whatnot that can land, because obviously they're generally going to be larger in size and whatnot. But that has been expanded. And for a lot of lawmakers and bureaucrats in DC, DCA is a very convenient airport. You can get in and out on Metro or Uber or whatever in 15 minutes. It's just a few stops away from DC on the Metro. So it's extremely convenient airport for lawmakers flying in and out, or anybody else is just flying in and out of the DC area. However, many politicians, including the two Democratic senators from Virginia, have been staunchly against. They've been really warning about expanding this parameter rule and then expanding flights, just the number of flights into D.C. Because of its size and just the complexity of for pilots flying in and out. Now, if you're going southbound or coming in from the southbound, you have a little bit more leeway. But this flight itself was coming from the south. And one of the issues is that it's hard to limit. There's going to be hard to limit, military, helicopter traffic, police, helicopter traffic, just the nature of DC, just everything that's going on. And so there's going to be, I think, going forward, there's going to be a lot more debate about this. And I think that the senators, Senator Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, I think that they will be bringing this up again. I'm not sure if it's going to, where it's going to go, but they have warned against this. They have been warning against, hey, there have been some near miss collisions there in the past between aircrafts, not necessarily a helicopter, military helicopter, but just planes in general, because just how busy the airport is, like I said, and just there's not a lot of room for error at this airport.
Well, Sarah, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Sarah. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on DOGE and the Trump administration's effort to make cuts, it's our Dan McCaleb.
Scrutiny of U.S. government spending heightened this week after President Trump's new Department of Government Efficiency, led by billionaire Elon Musk, started revealing all of the questionable foreign grants approved by the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, multi-million-dollar grants paid for by U.S. taxpayers for DEI programs in Asia, South America, and elsewhere. Tens of millions of dollars winding up in the hands of terrorists in the Middle East because of the lack of oversight by USAID. We could go on and on. What's going on here?
Well, what's going on here is just this has been business as usual, not just at USAID, but at these other federal agencies. Dan, we've talked about it on this podcast and at thecentersquare.com. We've covered just kind of the rampant waste, fraud, and abuse that's been present at these agencies for so long. When you see these headlines, they seem so silly that you think, oh, this must be some kind of conservative propaganda, thinks about, funding transgenderism in some totally impoverished, Central or South American country. But it's pretty much true. And not just the USA. I think the examination of this kind of spending is going to continue. I mean, one of the main priorities of the State Department, for instance, is to push the LGBTQ, et cetera, agenda around the world in the name of human rights. I mean, this is not a tertiary or fringe agenda for the State Department. It's a core goal of the State Department to push the LGBT agenda. So when we start opening up that State Department funding, it's going to be really interesting to see in other agencies, because of the total buy-in on DEI, have followed suit. But when it comes to USAID, I mean, they're a big pipeline for funds to go to, all over the world. So there's a few things happening here. One, sometimes the people receiving this money are just not the people who should be receiving it, whether it's terrorists, like, Hamas getting a hold of grant money. And the reason that happens, not just Hamas, but other terror groups, is because they're so in control of these countries. It's like the mafia. I mean, if you build a nice new grocery store in the middle of a mafia's territory, then all of a sudden the mafia comes knocking on your door, and guess what? Now you have to pay them for protection or whatever. So it's the same in these terror countries. It's very difficult for the money not to end up in their hands, especially when you're as careless as the U.S. has been. And then when you combine that with some of the far left, progressive gender and racial ideology, all of a sudden more and more of the funding in the name of human rights and equality is going to sort of stomach churning policies for Americans, whether it's the transgender issues in these different countries, or it's the NIH, as I've reported, the National Institute of Health, instead of researching cures, researching, racism and its effect on health. I mean, it's rampant throughout the government, and it's sort of a reckoning, day of judgment for those agencies.
Casey, it's not as if we don't have plenty of problems here in the U.S. Homelessness has been on the rise for years. We've had these huge national disasters over the last couple of years, hurricanes on the East Coast, the wildfires in California. I could go on and on there. Yet Democrats are being some elected Democrats anyway, are being highly critical of the scrutiny over USAID and other spending overseas by the federal government. I don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand it is part of the gospel that is accepted by the federal bureaucrats here who have embraced a total liberal agenda. They believe that America's history is essentially evil, that we have a moral obligation to help the rest of the world, to basically impoverish ourselves to help the rest of the world because we built our country on slavery and colonialism. And so what right do we have to even have this money? And, the way that they think that they spread that gospel, as they would think of it, as almost a religious idea, is by their, creating their version of racial and gender ideology all around the world. And so they're very committed to it. They're very organized. They have a lot of funding behind it, just from private groups, but now even the federal government, because it's basically been institutional capture, where these large federal agencies have been almost entirely taken over by liberal federal bureaucrats. Part of that is just the Obama era. Part of that is just the kind of person who wants to be a federal employee and thinks that's a good job is just more likely to be liberal. It's not necessarily a big conspiracy. It's just a personality trait. The kind of person who thinks that processing grants for nonprofits is like an exciting job is just more likely to have gone to Berkeley and has a view that's far more liberal than the rest of the country. There's a lot of things happening here, but the end result is, as there's been a lot of reporting, $2 million for transgender comic book in Peru, media paying millions for media in Cuba, sending money to the BBC, millions on even Politico Pro or Sesame Street in Iraq. The defenders of USAID have been quick to try to pick apart these examples. And I think some on the right have been kind of sloppy with how they've thrown these out, because sometimes when you look into it, it's like, well, it wasn't exactly all the money for this program. There was maybe an $8 million grant for this, and a portion of the money went to this highly controversial thing. So sometimes they're not quite specific. But by and large, I mean, I've been covering this long enough to know that I wasn't surprised at all by these things, because I've been covering different instances and different examples for many years.
Casey, U.S. national debt is at nearly $36.5 trillion. Financial watchdogs, economists have been warning for years that the U.S. needs to curb its spending. Another thing that President Trump has done is offer buyouts to federal employees to try and cut the federal workforce. But a judge on Thursday, just yesterday, put that on pause after lawsuits challenged it. What's next there?
Yeah, I mean, many of, Trump came in with these sweeping orders. Many of them are being challenged in court. But I think Trump has a good chance because he's much more organized this time around. He has good lawyers around him. He's really thought these things through. While he may riff off the cuff at the press conference, when you look at the executive orders, they're very, they're thorough. When you read the defenses for them, there's been a couple that are probably too far and are not going to survive. But by and large, they seem pretty tailored, pretty thought through, pretty focused. Like they were written, not after he came in office, written before he came in office. I'll say that. And so I think he faces a good shot legally, but he's going to have to fight these out. And even if he wins, that is going to delay his agenda. But I think that's part of the reason he's moving so quickly now. He's flooding the zone. A lot of these are going to slip through. The ones that get challenged, at least the battle's starting now. And I think he has a decent chance in fighting a lot of these and winning the cases.
Casey, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Will Governor Newsom succeed in getting aid for California after the state legislature voted to fund lawsuits against the Trump administration? What are the Trump administration's latest actions in addressing gender concerns in schools? And why did AI newcomer DeepSeek cause a disruption in the stock market? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Pam Bondi will assume the role of U.S. Attorney General after the Senate voted to confirm her 54-46 on Tuesday. Bondi faced opposition from Democrats who are wary of a Trump loyalist serving as the chief law enforcement officer of the federal government. During her confirmation hearing, Bondi said she would end the weaponization of the Department of Justice, particularly against people of faith targeted by the FBI under the Biden administration. Bondi promised to uphold fundamental rights, prioritize antitrust laws, advised Trump that drug cartels are terrorists, hold opioid manufacturers accountable, combat human trafficking, and assist in border security. U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry, and New Orleans Mayor LaToya Cantrell are assuring the public that Super Bowl 59 is being provided the most exhaustive security measures in the history of the game. Scores of armed military personnel and police officers, armored vehicles, enhanced security zones, X-ray machines, and training for identifying suspicious activity have all been promised by state and federal officials. The enhanced security comes after an American who pledged his allegiance to the Islamic State terrorist group drove a pickup truck through police barriers in New Orleans' historic French Quarter on January 1st, killing 14 and injuring at least 35 others. American farmers remain bullish on their futures, and fewer of them fear the prospects of a trade war. That's according to survey results released Tuesday by the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture. The report noted that U.S. producers expect 2025 to be better than 2024. While farmers remain highly optimistic about the future of their operations, they've also warmed up regarding the current state of their farms. The report cited improving crop prices as a reason for the increase in current expectations. Republicans at the Wisconsin state capitol want Democrats, including Governor Tony Evers, to not play politics with their latest immigration legislation. State Representative Tyler Austin and Senator Julian Bradley this week introduced legislation that would punish sheriffs across the state who do not cooperate with U.S. immigration officers. The proposed legislation, if it becomes law, would fine sheriffs 15% of their shared revenue dollars if they refuse to cooperate with ICE or refuse to hold illegal immigrants in their jails. 2 years to the day after a Norfolk Southern train derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, causing a toxic chemical burn and concerns over 2 states, more lawsuits have been filed. A Columbus area law firm announced the state and federal claims brought by 744 current and former East Palestine residents against Norfolk Southern, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and other state agencies. Attorneys say their ongoing investigations to legal claims cite a pattern of incidents dating back to 2013. The lawsuit says Norfolk Southern's crash rate increased 81% between 2013 and 2022. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on California Governor Gavin Newsom's visit to Washington, D.C., it's Eliana Kernodle.
California Governor Gavin Newsom is visiting President Donald Trump in Washington, D.C. to seek wildfire relief funding just after the state legislature passed bills to fund lawsuits against the Trump administration and deportation defense of illegal immigrants in a Newsom-called Trump-proofing special session. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Trupp. Kenneth, tell us about this visit.
Hey, Eliana. Newsom is visiting D.C. trying to get a lot of federal wildfire relief aid. He passed a $2.5 billion state relief bill, but with this fire expected to cause hundreds of billions of dollars in damage and be the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history, more federal funding may be necessary to aid in the cleanup effort and to harden against future fires.
What has Trump said about relief funding in the past?
Well, on his way out to California while stopping to visit victims of Hurricane Helene, he did say that he does support some conditions such as the adoption of voter ID laws and better water management for California. Recently, in the last few days, he also announced that he's seeking a federal investigation into the state's high-speed rail program, which has gone significantly over budget and over time.
This comes as the California Assembly voted to fund lawsuits against the Trump administration, as well as deportation defense for illegal immigrants. How will this play into the conversation?
Well, at a time when Governor Newsom is trying to get money from Republicans and the Trump administration, it does not seem like it would be to his advantage to eventually sign these bills. $50 million set of bills. The first is $25 million for lawsuits against the Trump administration, and the other is $25 million, mostly in legal aid for deportation defense of illegal immigrants, is something that has been part of a so-called Trump-proofing special session that Newsom has called. The timing of the session could not have come at a more difficult time for Newsom. And given that he does need to cooperate with federal officials and President Trump to get the money and support he needs, there are a lot of ongoing battles with California that could end up having to come to the forefront of this as we see Newsom asking for more aid and Trump puts on more conditions. Again, we talked a little bit about voter ID. That is a big issue in California, where the city of Huntington Beach actually adopted a local voter ID requirement for just municipal elections, resulting in the California legislature passing a law to ban local voter ID. So courts did uphold the Huntington Beach law at first before the new state law took effect. But now that the law is in effect, the state has appealed the ruling under the new state law. So we're going to get full adjudication on whether or not the state even has a right to ban voter ID at the local level. Speaking more to the high-speed rail plan, we did just see a report come out from the California Inspector General, who does oversee the state's high-speed rail plan, saying that it's not going to be done by even the delayed 2033 timeline, at least that initial 171-mile segment connecting Bakersfield and Merced in the Central Valley, which is very sparsely populated. That section is expected to cost in the mid-$30 billion range and probably will not be done until 2034 at the earliest. It also has a $6.5 billion funding shortfall for just that initial segment. Again, this isn't the whole Los Angeles to San Francisco segment. This is just connecting two cities in the sparsely populated Central Valley, and that will not be done on time or on schedule. Remember, this project was initially approved by voters in 2008 to the tune of about $10 billion. So having taken decades just to break ground on this project in January of this year is a serious indictment of the state's ability to do basic things.
Well, Kenneth, it'll be interesting to see how California and the Trump administration work together or don't in the coming days. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Aliana and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the Trump administration's effort to reverse Biden-era gender policies in schools. It's our Eliana Trudeau.
President Donald Trump signed an executive order last week outlawing what the White House termed radical indoctrination in K-12 schools. Joining me to tell us more about this is Chalkboard News editor Brennan Clary. Brennan, what are some of the details of this order?
Yeah, so it's a big sea change from the Biden administration. I think that's kind of been the underlying theme of a lot of the Trump administration's actions in the last few weeks, is to try to undo a lot of what the Biden administration had been doing, which I don't think is a big surprise. And it's just been a whirlwind trying to catch up a lot of the different kinds of orders or different kinds of statements from the Department of Education. But we've seen a big sea change in terms of how it's approaching gender ideology and what it calls discriminatory equity ideology. The new executive order calls on agency secretaries in the Biden administration to submit, quote, an ending indoctrination strategy. So that's their language there. And the idea behind that is to eliminate, quote, federal funding or support for illegal and discriminatory treatment and indoctrination in K-12 schools, including based on gender ideology and discriminatory equity ideology. So they're targeting these concepts that I think a lot of red states have already sort of tried to outlaw, this idea of like culturally divisive race theory, like critical race theory, different kinds of gender ideology, and sort of this idea that maybe you have inequality based on your characteristics. And so they're targeting these kinds of frameworks through any government contract. And so it's trying to top down looking for this kind of what it calls radical indoctrination and then trying to root it out systematically. So that is essentially what the order is trying to do. It's again, with a lot of these executive orders, it's not like here's the action that we're going to take. It's like here's what we are going to ask our agencies to submit a plan or like do a review and see what we're going to do and then take that action in a later time. So it's not like this is directly calling to like, as we've seen in other executive orders, like for the removal of all federal grants to stop while we figure it out. So, that caused a lot of upheaval. We don't have that sort of direct action here, but we do have a very intentional, calling for these kinds of plans to investigate, right, all federal funding that, quote, directly or indirectly support or subsidize the instruction, advancement, or promotion of gender ideology or discriminatory equity ideology. And that applies to either K-12 curricula, instruction and activities, as well as K-12 teacher education, certification, training, licensing, or employment training. So basically professional development for teachers or curricula for students. Like we don't want to have any kind of this, what the Trump administration calls, radical gender ideology or discriminatory equity ideology. So these kinds of things that we've written about in federally funded equity webinars, I think that would definitely fall under what the Trump administration is trying to target here. For example, that, you can have different social identity characteristics that influence your power and privilege, as being an oppressor and oppressed based on your, immutable characteristics, or school districts like Seattle Public Schools using social identity wheels to have students reflect on their privilege, or, and that's based on income, race, mental health, sexual identity, and religion, like these kind of immutable characteristics, and that they're protected by federal law as well. So I think that that's directly what the Trump administration is targeting, and that kind of there's a lot of focus on equity from the Biden administration. So it is a huge sea change in that effect.
And sort of on similar lines, the Office of Civil Rights under the Department of Education issued a Dear Colleague letter outlining its stance on Title IX. What did they have to say?
Yeah, so the Dear Colleague letter is sent to every school district in the nation, and basically says this is what the Department of Education's approach is going to be. And they also, huge sea change from the Biden administration. Again, not really a big surprise, but they're saying we will not recognize at all the 2024 Title IX rule that the Biden administration was trying very hard to implement until a federal judge struck it down earlier this year. So that is, it's not a huge, like, we are undoing everything. It sort of is like, hey, we're letting you know that we'll no longer be doing this. So from the Department of Education standpoint, it is an official, like the tides have changed. Like we're going a different direction with Title IX enforcement. It kind of goes along with the Trump administration's focus on, redefining sex as male and female, and these sort of these immutable characteristics, like and these different kinds of executive orders from the Trump administration. So that directive says it's in compliance with the Trump administration. So, and it, again, criticized the Biden administration in effect, and said that they didn't have a proper and textual meaning of or understanding of Title IX. So that was another thing. They said that the judge, in the case that where it was struck down, that federal judge expressed the proper textual and original meaning of Title IX, and praised that decision. And it also, said that as a constitutional matter, quote, the president's interpretation of the law, Title IX, governs because he alone controls and supervises subordinate officers who exercise discretionary executive power on his behalf. that unified control extends to the Education Department and the Office of Civil Rights. Therefore, Title IX must be enforced consistent with President Trump's executive order. And that executive order is on sex characteristics, on saying that there are two sexes, male and female. And again, like a very different sea change from the Biden administration, and that they intend to uphold the 2020 Title IX rules and not the 2024. And there was a lot of praise from critics of the Biden administration's changes. So the Southeastern Legal Foundation actually has a ongoing litigation against the Biden administration for its rewrite, they call it, of the Title IX rules. So they were very, very excited to see the Department of Education's kind of official position change on this. And the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, the FIRE, the free speech organization, they were more supportive of it in terms of the higher education aspect. So that's something that we don't usually write about at Chalkboard News because it's a little bit out of our purview. But there's some changes that are important that govern the rights of due process and for students at this higher education level. So that's going back to the 2020 rules. That is a big change in terms of how colleges and universities are to handle allegations of sexual assault under Title IX. So there's a lot of different things that go into this at, the K-12 and also higher education level.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Join me to discuss DeepSeek and its impact on the stock market. It's PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy.
Dr. O, a very interesting week, to close out the month of January. I think, there's been no shortage of conversations about AI and AI being, integral to the future. I think a lot of people were sort of kind of tracking along and looking at the players in the market that, that had already come along. ChatGPT, probably, OpenAI being the chief among them. And certainly there are a lot of mostly U.S. derivatives, that have been brought to market. And all of a sudden, China, rolls out this product called DeepSeek, and it just, in a very stunning way, it created market chaos. Certainly, for people who hold NVIDIA in their portfolios, you might have noticed a little bit of a downward bump.
Downward bump. I mean, how about what, 17%?
Yeah, trust me. I think my phone nearly caught on fire from the alerts that I was getting, about the market. I believe that was on Tuesday. So nonetheless, I mean, let's talk about this. DeepSeek comes like literally out of nowhere. I mean, in theory, China has restrictions on chip technology that the United States has imposed upon it. But they apparently found their way to enough of NVIDIA's chips to be able to create something that was pretty remarkable. But the underlying, I think, market issue was that the people at DeepSeek said that they had built this thing on maybe, $5.5 billion. Meanwhile, there's been billions of dollars invested in AI, and that just created, mass confusion, I think, in the market. What do we know? What have we learned here?
I mean, look, I think you summarize it pretty well. Like, why would an investor be concerned, right? If we're able to get this kind of technology at a lower cost, then this could put downward pressure on like AI subscription pricing, shrinking margins for companies like OpenAI, Google's AI division, right? Why pay for the cost of, a Microsoft solution when you can get the same for much cheaper, right?
Right.
And so, all the big tech stocks that had been bid up essentially by AI, right? The promise of AI, right? NVIDIA, Microsoft, Google, right? Basically took a massive hit. And so that's why we saw what we saw. It kind of, I guess it kind of reminds me of this question of innovation versus kind of adaptation, right? So like you kind of if you're using if your new technology is basically using some existing technology to create something that is, more affordable for the end user, is that a good thing or not? Does it violate some sort of patent, law? And I'm not a lawyer, by the way. I'm asking all these questions because I remember.
You could have been. Your parents are already pretty proud of you, but you could have been a lawyer too. You know, I mean, the PhD thing, you know, I guess some people are impressed by that, but you could have been a lawyer and a PhD.
I think lawyers are smarter. So you know, during the pandemic, right? We had this whole thing between, Pfizer, and Pfizer, biotech, using mRNA technology to rapidly create effective vaccines. And in August 2022, Moderna filed a patent infringement lawsuit against Pfizer and biotech, right? Alleging that their vaccine had infringed on Moderna's patent related to mRNA technology, right? And so I guess the question is, you know, how do we balance this thing, right? How do we get, good news for the end user, for sure, right?
Well, competition ultimately is. I think though that I want to go back to the investor because, I mean, there were a lot of people who had to change their diaper this week. I mean, that was pretty stunning. I mean, pretty stunning. I mean, you hadn't heard anything, you know, in the market or anywhere around the market where it wasn't NVIDIA, and this thing just looked like it was sort of an unstoppable locomotive. Meanwhile, you know, it sounds like, you know, over in China in some garage somewhere for $5.5 billion, now they built something that frankly is supposedly was every bit as good. But already there's issues. There's issues with it. I guess a couple of things. One, why did the market act like that? Why did the market just completely lose its mind? I mean, what?
Well, I brought it up, right? So, if consumers have access to cheaper, technology, to the technology at a much lower cost, then how much can you charge for it, right? So remember, investors, bid up prices, right? In the stock market, because they expect earnings to grow into a company's valuation. And so, right, so you're bidding up this company because you think that future earnings will be large enough or earnings will grow enough to justify the valuations that you've put on these companies, right? And if of course, and by the way, that's why we talk about PE ratios, right? Price to earnings. Right. If it just turns out that the company fails to generate the type of earnings or even profits that you had hoped that it would, right? Then the company's overvalued. And what tends to happen then is the stock drops, the stock falls, right? And so that's what was kind of playing out, this week, where the question became, are those companies perhaps overvalued? And that's what caused, the big stock sell-off.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Krug, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.